And we are live on YouTube. And now I will let everybody in. All right, we're getting going here. Good evening, everyone. If you're just joining us, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. Just opened the door. It'll take a couple minutes to let everybody in. Welcome. Zoom tight.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Again, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. Doors have just opened. We'll wait till we hit a magic number and then we'll get started.
Hey, Matt, you want to adjust the chat functions while we're waiting?
Good idea. Hang on one sec. Okay. We'll get started in just a minute, folks. We'll give it one more minute. Counting down here. We'll get started in just a second. Is one long minute. There we go. Okay. Good evening, everybody. My name is Matt Losack. I'm the executive director and co-founder of the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. Founded in 2010, we are the first and only regional nonprofit dedicated exclusively to renter outreach, education, organizing, and advocacy. In addition to our board treasurer, who's on with us as a panelist tonight, Josh Fisher, we have our staff. From top to left to top right is Malek Demir, David Mullins, our outreach director, Tim Huang, outreach coordinator, Pat Beckham, outreach coordinator, Emily Towie, outreach coordinator, and of course, well known for her testimony yesterday in support of Kate Stewart's bill on notice, which we'll discuss a little bit later in the discussion. Tonight, we're just going to do sort of a basic discussion of what's going on with the legislation that has passed or is pending in the state and in the county, as well as a discussion of legislative issues and protections in the municipalities. That's Gaithersburg, Rockville, and Tacoma Park. If you have any questions or concerns, please raise them in the chat. Our staff will be monitoring the chat, and also we'll take an opportunity, as we always do, to address any questions or concerns that any tenant has that we can answer. And if we can't answer it, then we'll try to follow up via email or telephone call tomorrow or later this week if we have an issue or a concern that we can't address tonight. So this was a very interesting legislative session at the state level. The Maryland General Assembly began its and also we're recording on YouTube. So if you miss something, you can watch it again on YouTube. The Maryland General Assembly session started in mid-January and ended April 8th, I believe, with what's called sine die, which means there's nothing else to do. There were several bills before the General Assembly that were renter protection bills. Obviously, we supported all of the bills that advance renters' rights and advance renter protections, but there were a handful of bills that were most important priorities for us. We supported a bill that our board member, Vaughn Stewart, Delegate Vaughn Stewart, put out called the Tenant Safety Act. I'm pleased to report that that bill did pass both the House of Delegates and the Senate, and is now awaiting the governor's signature. So that's a win for us. And it's a bill that would allow tenants to pursue remedies through the court acting collectively. In the past, a tenant that had a complaint in his or her apartment building would have to file with the court individually. Now, tenants are allowed to file collectively, like a union, and get a remedy collectively that way. David, do you want to give some more detail about the Tenant Safety Act? You were most familiar with the details.
Well, I mean, that's the gist of it that I remember is the change. I mean, I think that was also the one that allowed tenants to seek lawyer fees in certain actions, that kind of evening out just what feels kind of like looking now at an absurd situation where that wasn't even an option for tenants, where it was for landlords. But no, that my understanding is just actually like making it way easier to collectively come in, because right now, as you mentioned, you have to just have your own separate rent escrow action based on your own case. And then when there's we work with communities that we've got some folks who have a lot of folks have the same issue, and some of them have more time and the means and ability to go to court. But this would just but then also some are not getting involved because they're afraid to do that individual process. They're afraid of retaliation. All these things supposedly are going to be helped because of that collective means that go in.
Right. We're going to post the
another reason to organize your building and have tenant associations, because there is strength in numbers.
Correct. But now there's a legal reason to act collectively as well if you're going to pursue a remedy for a maintenance issue in your bill. Thank you, Tim. That legislation, if you want to read it, is now posted in the chat, and we'll post each one of these as we go. In addition, there was another bill that we had actually proposed to the Governor Westmore Miller administration when Secretary Jake Day was first announced to be the Secretary of the Housing Department for the state. We met with him and explained, and he readily understood, that the department really had nothing in terms of support for tenants. There was a whole lot of discussion and a whole lot of built-in infrastructure in terms of support for building new homes or for homeowners, but there was nothing really for protecting tenants' rights. And given that the state of Maryland and many parts of the country are now nearly 40% renter, buying a home these days is out of reach for most of us, for middle-class working families and low-income families that live in the more expensive metropolitan areas like Washington and New York and Boston and Houston and San Francisco and Seattle and other parts of the country, Chicago. Try to buy a house in downtown Silver Spring. 30 years ago, it was $90,000. Now it's about $650,000. So the working person, working family, the salaries have not increased to keep up with that expense. So increasingly more people are moving into rental housing, not just as a station on the way to owning, but actually as a permanent way of life. So we spoke to the secretary, the then nominated secretary, about establishing a position in the Department of Housing and Community Development that would pursue renters' rights, establish a Bill of Rights for renters, and provide outreach to tenants and explore and research best practices around the state for protecting and stabilizing the quality and affordability of rental housing. And that was House Bill 693. That was part of Governor Westmore's housing affordability package. There were two other bills that went into housing development and investing in more housing, and we don't take a position one way or other on those. We're interested in what happens to people when they actually get into their homes and how to protect their homes. But we did support 693, and it passed. And I believe it is also awaiting the governor's signature, which could happen as early as tomorrow, I believe. So those are two bills that made some progress. And having the governor speak to the need to protect renters and to advance renters' rights is historic. We have not seen that in the state of Maryland, either with Democratic governors and certainly not with Governor Hogan, who was crickets when it came to renters' rights. So now we have what we believe to be a partner in pursuing renters' rights and renter protection legislation in the Maryland General Assembly. That's the good news.
Oh, hey, Matt.
Sorry, go ahead, David.
Just one quick note before we leave House Bill 693. I think that's the one that also raised the fee to file an eviction case in court. And because ours was the lowest in the nation, which kind of led to our high filing rate. That did get through it. I don't remember the exact amount, but it raised it significantly.
Yes, Maryland is still the highest eviction filing rate state in the nation. And some of that was attributed to us having the lowest, if not one of the lowest, filing rates in the country, which made many landlords utilize the courts as a kind of a collection agency. And so not only were tenants who would be late a few days with their rent, even though they paid their rent for years, but would be late either because their Social Security checks came in late or because they're just struggling and people are juggling, but they did pay their rent. But the moment it becomes late, landlord would file in court, get the court to use it as a hammer. So then the tenant would have to pay a late fee, have to miss a day of court, a day of work to go to court, and then have the thing dismissed or pay it down, and creating a really large headache for the tenants, and usually one that is targeting in particular working in low-income families, and then finding that it was easy for the landlord to do that for just $15. Raising the fee might cause some landlords to pause a little bit before they file. We don't think that the fee that was raised was enough, but it is some progress. Attorney General Brian Frosh, the former Attorney General, had proposed raising it to $115. That was last year, and we were very concerned and made it a red line for us that you can raise the fee, but it cannot be passed through to the tenants. Because if the tenant has to pay that fee that the landlord pays, then what's to stop the serial filing of irresponsible landlords using the courts as a collection agency? So I believe they split the baby on this one, where they've raised it to $43. Was it 43, David?
No, I don't remember the amount.
It's 40-something bucks. But they've allowed that if the tenant loses the case, then they can have the pass-through. We're not happy about that either. So, there's more work to be done, but some of the other benefits of the legislation are still in place. So, anyway, that's the progress that was made this year. There was some other progress on some other bills that we won't detail tonight. But again, getting the governor's office, getting the House of Delegates to have a chatter and discussion on renters' rights that was very supportive of renters' rights this year was historic and a great deal of progress. for those of us who are facing imminent problems with our landlord, this stuff is never fast enough. Anybody who's lived through the civil rights era can tell you that civil rights did not happen fast enough. In fact, it took decades upon decades to get legislation passed to protect everyone's equal rights before the law and so on. Tenants are having the same problem in the state of Maryland. For many years, when I first started this in 2007, I went to the Silver Spring Citizens Advisory Board and said, I'd like to get active. And the advisory board said, what do you mean? You're a renter. You don't pay taxes. And, you're sort of a second-class citizen. And I said, well, where do you think my rent goes? But people didn't understand. Fast forward, I became president of the Silver Spring Citizens Advisory Board, and more than half the board were renter because the demographics have changed, and there's an increasing recognition that nearly 40% and growing number of residents in the state of Maryland are living in rental housing permanently. But that housing is unstable, either because people are being priced out or because people are being targeted for eviction unfairly. So lots more work to be done, and we are at least as frustrated as anybody out there might be tonight. Which brings me to our greatest frustration in the Maryland General Assembly this year, and one that we're going to really have to consider how to address it. Thanks to the good work of Delegate Janelle Wilkins, who is a former board member of the Renters Alliance for 7 years, who has championed this legislation. She championed the Just Cause, renamed Good Cause, local enabling legislation. For years, we have been pursuing this. For at least 10 years, we've been pursuing this. Just cause protections mean that a landlord has to automatically renew your lease each year, absent a justifiable reason not to. Right now in the state of Maryland, with 60 days notice at the end of your lease, the landlord could say, without providing any explanation, that he or she is not going to renew your lease. If you stay 1 day longer than the lease term, the landlord can file for eviction for what's known as tenant holding over, that is staying 1 day longer than the lease term allows. We have seen how this is abused by landlords who are targeting people who are on public subsidies, people who are vocal about the quality of life in their building, people who demand their rights, demand maintenance, demand promised or required services, file complaints with the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs. Retaliation is illegal in the state of Maryland and in Montgomery County. However, if the landlord does not have to state the reason for not renewing your lease, it's very, very difficult to defend against that action. And we're seeing an increasing number of landlords who are utilizing that process to circumvent a due process of evicting somebody with a good reason. You got a good reason to evict somebody, you're breaking the law, you're disrupting the community in some substantial way, then say it. Well, say what's going on. But the he said, she said, I don't like them. They came into my office and they said the rent that we raised them 25% was too high. The rats in the basement are a problem. We're forming a tenants association and the property management goes after them or the landlord goes after them with eviction. That is a very chilling approach to renter protections that must stop. So this legislation, thanks to Delegate Janelle Wilkins, thanks to County Executive Mark Elrich, county executives from across the state, the mayor of Baltimore, county council people from Prince George's County, the Maryland Association of Counties, and thousands of renters and scores of civic organizations and nonprofits who testified in favor of this legislation. And thanks to the change in leadership in the Environment and Transportation Committee, taking Kumar Barve, the delegate from Bethesda, who opposed this legislation for years. He left, got a job somewhere else. And Delegate Mark Corman came in, who is a very wise and professional, a lawyer, to head that committee, and it passed. It passed overwhelmingly in the Environment and Transportation Committee once we removed that logjam. And then it went to the House of Delegates General Assembly to vote on. And it passed 96-37. Remarkable. And the governor's office, the Department of Housing and Community Development's legislative director, on behalf of Governor Westmore's administration, testified in support of passing the legislation. The legislation would not have passed just cause. It would have enabled every local jurisdiction in the state of Maryland to pass it if they so choose. It wouldn't have even made just cause the law of the land. It just would have said Montgomery County can pass it if we so choose, and we would have. So unfortunately, though, then it went over to the Senate, and it goes over to the Judicial Proceedings Committee, which is chaired by Delegate Will Smith from D20 from Tacoma Park. And it got, we believe, would have had the majority votes, but for whatever reason we cannot figure out, the chair did not bring it to a vote. And because he did not bring it to a vote, it obviously could not get out of committee and then go to the Senate at large for a Senate vote. We are enormously disappointed at that reality. It was one thing, it was a heroic effort to get it out of the House of Delegates. And we had thought that legislation that basically says no one should lose their home without a good reason ought to pass. So that's where we are. I can't tell you how disappointed we are, but we have lived through this scenario before, and we live to fight another day. But I do urge all of you who are listening that we need you now and all the way through next year to keep your powder dry, and let's figure out where the snake bite was in the Senate that kept this thing from going through. We know all the arguments against the sky's going to fall. Nobody will ever build again in Maryland. The landlords will be up in arms and so on. Every place where just cause exists in the United States, that is untrue. Development continues. People live in their houses more securely. People who should be evicted, unfortunately, can still be evicted. So something else is at work, and it's probably what you think, that a very powerful lobbying group, multi-billion-dollar industry, worked its wonders on the Senate to keep that from happening. And some of the senators who are themselves landlords, stuck their party line with the industry that supports their pocketbooks. This has got to change. So that was the most, and of all the legislation, it is a Renters Alliance position that protecting a person's home against unjust eviction is the most important protection that any legislation can perform. So we'll work on that going down the road. That's the state General Assembly information in brief that we can offer tonight. Let's move now to the county. As many of you know, another piece of legislation that we've been pushing since we were formed back in 2010, and I can say in all honesty, something that County Council member and then County Executive Mark Elrich has also been pushing for as long as he's been in politics, and that's rent stabilization in Montgomery County. We worked very hard to get a rent stabilization bill across the line. The bill that passed was not what we wanted, but it was progress. We wanted to see a 3% cap. There was a 6% cap. There were two amendments that we vehemently opposed. One was that new buildings would have 23 years of exemption. So if your building was built 22 years ago, you got one more year of exemption. If it was built this year, you got 23 years of exemption. That was an amendment brought forward by Councilmember Dawn Ludke. Another amendment that was brought forward by Councilmember Dawn Ludke was that small landlords with 6 or fewer units would also be, is it 6 or fewer, 2 or few, David? 2?
I do not remember.
Suffice to say, small landlords, I think it might be 2, but I'm not sure, are exempt as well. And yet there are thousands of people who live in homes that are owned by small landlords. it is the Renters Alliance position that whether you be a small landlord or a large landlord, you have the same responsibilities. And that responsibility in your industry is to provide stable, quality, affordable housing on balance with your right to make a profit and to manage the property. So we don't get that one either. And we do also understand the 23-year thing, just so people understand what that means. If you're investing $100, $200 million in building a new property, you have every right to make that money back and to figure out what your market is and to make a profit. So there is a time of exemption that does make sense. 23 years, though, we don't get. What if you make it all back in 10 years? Okay, why not have a rule in the legislation, which we suggested, that, say make it 10 years, since that seems like a reasonable one, and then check in and show us your books. Show us whether you've made money, and if you haven't made money, we'll give you another 5 years and see how it goes. Why not track it so that it's rational instead of giving a very generous period of time where money can be made, but people are going to live in unstable homes. So the balance just didn't seem to be there. So the rent stabilization bill was signed July 18th, I believe, by County Executive Mark Elridge, but there was a stipulation. The stipulation was that certain regulations would need to be developed to go along with it. For example, what would happen if a landlord was, because of the rent stabilization cap of 6%, was not able to make a profit? So how would that landlord be able to get what's known as a fair return? So they would have to provide a petition. There has to be a process. So a regulation that outlines that process would be one of those things. There are fees that are charged by landlords. What if landlords decided to charge you an extra $500 a month to park your bicycle? Well, that would be a good way to get around the rent stabilization bill. So there has to be regulation that says you can't do that. So the Department of Housing and Community Affairs is working on those regulations. They published a draft of the regulations, I believe, in the beginning of March. They were published in the County Register as required for 30 days. Maybe it was the end of January. It was the end of January.
Last day of January.
Last day of January, and then for 30 days in February. And then they received, yes, that's right, in 30 days. And then they received, we understand, about 150 pages of recommendations. So we had hoped to see those regulations, which need to then go, once approved, to the county council for approval to get over there in March. That still has not happened. So we have not gotten a definitive answer from the Department of Housing and Community Affairs yet, or for that matter, our friends on the council, as to when those regulations are going to come to the council and get voted on. So all of us are living in limbo, not knowing if we're going to be protected by rent stabilization. This obviously is deeply concerning to all of us because many people are not protected. They're still seeing excessive rent increases, of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 double-digit rent increases. Some irresponsible landlords are racing to raise rents ahead of the rent stabilization regulation. Some of the more responsible ones, at least, are staying under 6%, and we applaud them for doing so. But the regulations and the legislation have not taken effect yet. And so we are tracking that, but we unfortunately don't have any good news so far. But as soon as we do, we will announce it immediately. But again, the council does have to receive them, does have to review them, and does have to vote on them. Once that happens, then the law will take effect. By the way, if you have any questions about any of this legislation, please put your questions or concern in the chat, and we'll try to address them as we go along.
You had a question just now about a 2.6% that went into effect in March. I think they might be referring to the voluntary rent guidelines, which someone just clarified in the chat.
Yes, and if you all could post those in the chat for reference. That's the key word, David. It's voluntary. That's why we've been pursuing rent stabilization, which is not voluntary. The voluntary rent increase guidelines are a consumer price index based on housing. And they are put out each year by the county, by the Department of Housing and Community Affairs, based on that index that recommends what a landlord can raise rents to in order to keep up with legitimate overhead expenses. Presumably, any responsible, competent landlord, when they charge rent in the first place, that rent will include overhead and a margin of profit. So we certainly agree that they should be able to maintain that margin of profit. But what we don't want to see is them say, hey, look, I can make a whole lot more money, but I have no responsibility for a family or an individual's stability of their home. That doesn't work. But right now we have Wild West. So they look at the guidelines and they ignore them because they're voluntary. So responsible landlords will look at them and stick to them. Irresponsible landlords will say that the only guideline they need to follow is what the market will bear, and they raise rents as much as they possibly can without regard to the individual or family's housing stability and for what that impact might be on the rest of us in our community when we see people unstable in their homes. So any other questions on that?
Not on that, but a different question. I don't know.
Related?
It's no, not related to that.
All right. Well, we'll get around to all questions at some point, but let me just go through the last piece of legislation that we're working on with a council member, Kate Stewart. She proposed in consultation with us and others legislation that would require landlords to provide certain types of notice to their tenants, notice that has not been required in the past. For example, a notice of what an emergency plan might be in their building, a fire emergency plan, some sort of requirement that asks them to put that together in consultation with the appropriate government authorities, in this case, probably the Department of Housing and Community Affairs. For example, where are the fire extinguishers? What is a fire drill? How many fire drills are you supposed to have each year? What is the escape plan in the event that there's a problem in the building that requires an emergency that requires people to get out as fast as possible? If there are people who are disabled on upper floors, what is the plan for getting them out, and so on? There has been no requirement for our county's landlords to do that. This bill would require it if it passes. We testified in support of it yesterday. Emily Towie testified on our behalf. And that is also on YouTube. And people can watch that testimony from not only from Emily, but from many other people who testified in support of it. In addition, in part because we've known about this for a while, but Councilmember Stewart, who just is a new council member, was introduced to this firsthand in the Arrive Silver Spring fire, when we found that many tenants who were required to purchase the landlord's renter's insurance did not realize that what they were required to purchase did not protect their belongings, but only the landlord's property. So they thought they were covered, and when the fire happened, they lost all their belongings and were not covered by any insurance. So this bill would also require that the landlord provide full disclosure about the nature of that renter's insurance, which, by the way, we oppose. Not the legislation. We oppose the idea of a landlord forcing tenants to pay for renter's insurance that does not provide any benefit to the tenant. Another part of this legislation is requirements to provide ample notice to tenants when there are going to be disruptions in the building. Say you're going to be looking at renovations. Say you're going to be doing some kind of power outages, water shutoffs, and so on. Too many times, we see this too frequently, where tenants will call us and say, we've got no hot water. And the landlord's known that they were going to shut it off for weeks, but they didn't tell us until today that we have no hot water. Or likewise, that they're going to be tearing down or doing renovations on a whole side of the building that is going to create jackhammering and dust and other disruptions. and we have no notice of that. This bill would require that they have notice. So we're very pleased about that. And an amendment that we have proposed, the Renters Alliance, that we think has gotten a good deal of support. We believe that notice should also include, or information to the tenants as notice should include, information about crimes that occur in the property, in the building, and around the property. Too often we've seen where a crime takes place in the parking lot or in the building, and the only information that the tenants have is that something happened and they got it by rumor or gossip in the hallways, and it's very alarming. In some cases, it could help people avoid parts of the building or parts of the parking lot at certain times when certain crimes have occurred repeatedly. And other times, it could tell tenants to act collectively to address a security issue in the building. In any case, we think that crimes should be reported so that tenants in the building can know what's going on in the building, and that the public should know, especially anybody who might be considering whether to move into an apartment complex that is having multiple problems with crimes in certain parts of the property. So that's, we think from just a consumer affairs standpoint, that should be fully disclosed. College campuses have to disclose this. They have to keep that record all the time. And it used to be the Department of Housing and Community Affairs tracks landlord-tenant complaints and code complaints. And in the past, they used to track crime reports. And they're not doing that anymore. So we don't think it's entirely novel to request that this be formalized, but we have not gotten any assurance that it will be an approved amendment, but we hope so. And again, as we said with all of this legislation that has yet to pass or is on its way, reach out to your council members, reach out to your state delegates, to your state senators, and give them an earful. And as Pat Beckham on my staff likes to point out, we are renters and we vote. So they need to know that often as best. That's right, Pat. That was my cue. So very, very important that they hear from us and know that we are not second-class citizens. We are members of the community, and we vote and we pay attention. So I think that's sort of the roundup. Anybody else? Is there anything that in the legislative world that we want to mention or clarify or provide more detail to before we move on?
Did you mention that just on that last bill that, I'm sorry, I stepped away, but they would require someone to have a 24-hour contact, not just for quote unquote emergencies?
Thank you. Go ahead.
Well, that would, they took now the law is if there's an emergency or something, someone from property management you have to be able to get a hold of them, but it was confusing about what's an emergency, what's not. So they took that out, and now just someone there has to be a number for someone 24/7 that the tenants can reach. That would be part of the bill too.
Well, I mean, I think there, as far as I know, and I could be wrong, but I believe that there always had to be a 24-hour number. But what we've seen is that, and I know this firsthand, we've called those numbers and nobody answers, or there's an answering machine. In one building across the way from me, there's a waterfall happening on the second floor coming down the stairs, and we're calling and nobody is answering the phone. The next thing that the tenants have to do is call the fire department or the police, when actually this is something that building maintenance should address immediately. So the concern about the emergency was, we don't, and I think this is fair. You can't have somebody calling at 3 o'clock in the morning saying, "Oh my God, I saw a cockroach run across the top of my stove." That's not we need to be sure we distinguish between how to use 911, so to speak, and likewise the 24-hour number in the building for genuine emergencies. But I hope they didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because being able to contact property owner or a legitimate representative of the property owner to address an emergency needs to happen. So we'll see how it evolves. This bill is we had testimony yesterday. As I say, it is something that you all can view on YouTube. I don't believe there was any opposition testimony. I believe everybody was in favor, and the testimony was diverse, authoritative, and made a whole lot of sense. So I think it's got a lot of support, and none of the council seemed to push back as well. But it has to now go to the Planning, Housing, and Parks Committee, which oversees housing, of course, to get into the weeds and look at the actual language and decide what is going to work. And there'll be another opportunity for us and you all who want to participate to attend that hearing and possibly testify if testimony is allowed. Then it will come back to the full council for a vote. So we're tracking this one too, and we'll let you know how it goes. But be active, and we'll put links in our newsletters as we go. If you're on this webinar, then you'll be in our database, and we'll receive our newsletters as we send them out. And from time to time, we will provide updates and links to legislation and legislation progress.
And you had a couple questions about the timing of the rent stabilization bill. We had someone asking if they're gonna get an increase possibly in June. Do we think it will have taken effect? And someone else was asking, just as soon as the regulations get approved, is there another wait period, or is that probably the go time?
No, it's been signed by the county executive. So literally, it's once the council votes to approve the regulations, then it becomes in effect. So we're waiting on that vote, and I don't know the answer. All I can tell you is we have been told 4 deadlines that have all been passed for perhaps legitimate reasons. I don't want to hit that too hard, but we had hoped that this would be done in March. It's now approaching May, and the regulations have not made their way to the council for review yet. There may be very good reasons for that, but obviously we're all very frustrated, and tenants who are receiving these increases, and the bulk of increases and renewals take place in the spring and early summer for obvious reasons, when school's out, when people change over and all the rest. But it hasn't happened yet, and it's very frustrating. So I wish I could answer that question with greater definition. Tim?
So two questions on the chat. So just to clarify, if they're waiting on like a lease renewal, and the rent increase is higher than the 6%, then we're not sure what would happen when it takes.
There's no protection.
Okay.
Right now, until the bill takes effect, there is no protection.
But if, let's say that they're ready to sign a new lease, like soon, should they try to wait until the bill passes to sign that lease, or should they, or would it not make a difference? And the second kind of related question to the leases is someone asked if the landlord gave them a lease renewal offer and then cancels the offer less than 30 days before the lease ends, is that legal?
Well, it depends. I have to take a look at that. We're not lawyers, so we just play them on TV, but I'd have to take a look at that. Some renewal offers give a certain grace period to consider. All renewals for a lease require that the increase be 90 days prospective. So, you know, they can't say, here's your renewal and it takes effect tomorrow. They have to give you 90 days. Also, by the way, legislation that the Renters Alliance championed. I don't know. I'd have to take a look at the renewal. If you're not sure, send it to us. I would recommend that make sure you read what the renewal notice says and what the requirements are in terms of timing. But I would recommend not signing a renewal notice for the longest period of time you can do so without risking the renewal notice. If you don't sign the renewal after a certain period of time, then you might lose it. On the other hand, just to be clear, that if you your renewal can't be rescinded because the property manager doesn't like something you've said or something. They can't retaliate by rescinding a renewal notice. So, for example, if you've received a renewal notice that is defective, which we see often, Renewals are supposed to include certain information. It's supposed to include your current rent, the increase percentage, the voluntary rent increase guidelines, how to contact the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs. They have to offer you a 2-year lease. Even if they offer you a 1-day lease, they have to offer you a 2-year lease. So there are certain elements in a renewal notice that must be there by law. And if they're not, then the renewal notice is defective. And if a month or two into you're considering your renewal, you realize it's defective and you go back and say, hey, it's defective, reissue me a properly formatted renewal notice. And they say, you know what, because you told us that, we're not going to give you one at all. That would be illegal. So on all these other ones, I'd have to take a look, or my staff would. And if we're not sure, we would take it to the lawyers or to the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs to get an expert opinion.
But then to offer that lease in the first place at all, whether it's a year or what have you, that's still fully at the discretion of the landlord. So we had a question that if someone's month to month, you're waiting for this to go through. If you're, you go automatically, you'll be month to month. If your lease expires and there's no notice to vacate or any other change made, you'll end up being month to month. However, the landlord can still raise the rent even in that once a year, even in that month to month scheme. But then also, as far as like a tenant could definitely ask then for a year lease at any point, but they wouldn't be compelled to do that.
That's right. They do not have to offer you a renewal. Again, because we don't have just cause, we don't have that renewal. If they offer you no renewal, but they also do not give you a notice to vacate, which they'd have to give you, then you automatically go month to month, which we don't like, but that is a reality. They can only raise your rent once in a 12-month period under any circumstances. It is the Renters Alliance position that if they give you an increase in rent, it ought to be considered a renewal. That is not, however, the position of the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs. They believe that an increase in rent is not a renewal. It's just an increase in rent, that actually a renewal with terms like a 1 year or 2 years or whatever, that's a renewal. That's a fight we are intending to have, but we have not had it yet, and we have not won it yet, much less. So that's where we are in terms of renewals. Anything else? Okay, then we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about the municipalities. And at the end of that discussion, if anybody has any other question or concern about their situation that you would like us to address in this forum, we'd be happy to do so. If anybody has any individual question or concern or complaint about their situation that is not appropriate for this webinar, but they'd like us to consult on, you can always contact us at info@rentersalliance.org. Get that out there and send us an email with the situation and how to contact you, and we will follow up subsequent to the webinar. So with us tonight is a council member who's been a champion for renters in Rockville, and we're pleased to have Ms. Isola Shaw with us, and she's going to talk about what we all should have to keep in mind, and that is that Takoma Park, Rockville, and Gaithersburg are independent municipalities. If we passed rent stabilization in Montgomery County today, it would not impact the laws of Takoma Park, Rockville, and Gaithersburg. Now, fortunately for Rockville, they have their own rent stabilization. They were ahead of everybody else.
Takoma Park.
Takoma
Park.
What did I say?
At Rockville.
All right, sorry. Takoma Park.
In the future.
Aging and disability. So yes, Takoma Park has their own rent stabilization program. They've had it for quite some time. Rockville and Gaithersburg are behind not only in rent stabilization, but in other renter protections. So there's a growing discussion going on because of a growing number of active tenants in Gaithersburg and in Rockville, including Isola Shaw, the city council member from Rockville, to bring these municipalities up at least to Montgomery County standards of renter protections, rent stabilization, code enforcement, and the rest, and maybe even go beyond. So with that, let me turn it over to Councilmember Isola Shaw to talk about Rockville and what she's doing. Isola.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you for inviting me back. It's really good to be here. And yeah, that was a really great introduction to Rockville and the difference between Rockville and the county. When the county passed the bill last year, unfortunately, the city of Rockville actually wrote a letter opposing rent stabilization. And that was one of the reasons why I decided to run. And I was elected as the first renter to serve for the city of Rockville. And we are a city of about 50% of Rockville is made up of renters. So we really are underrepresented and we really need rent stabilization. So I have been knocking doors since last year. And recently, just asking tenants to share their stories, how much they received an increase, what they're going through. And so rent stabilization is really, really popular. And they heard what's going on in the county and they want rent stabilization. So a couple months back, I introduced a rent stabilization discussion, which will be on the agenda on July 8th. And so we are asking tenants, folks in the community, renter allies to come out and share their stories, share how much increases they have received, which by the way, there was one community that received anywhere from 6% to 70%, 70. There was another community on Rockville Pike that has received, there were tenants that were receiving about $100 to $500, which as we know is really an eviction. And so the tenants in Rockville really need to pass this law. And so I have been pushing for rent stabilization, and we really want to make sure that that conversation on rent stabilization on July 8th, we can use that to turn that into a rent stabilization policy and do something like the county, if not stronger. But really use the county. The county has a solid bill and we should really leverage that. And so I would like to answer any questions, or Matt, if you have any other questions about Rockville.
Well, first we'll have some comments, and we want to congratulate you on being the first tenant member of the Rockville City Council. It's about time. So now if we can get some of other tenants to also run for City Council, I think that would help advance the renter cause. One thing we've learned over the years, and I'm sure you know this, Isola, is that we don't want to wait till July 8th to show up. I think that maybe, and we'd love to work with you on this, if we could organize tenants to meet individually with your colleagues on the council to talk with them in advance, because, you know, we've been doing this a while, and, you know, the phony opposition stories that come up, as I mentioned earlier, that the sky is going to fall, that the rental housing industry will collapse, that the landlords will all pick up stakes and move to other states, and there'll be no housing, and you know, and so on and so on. And none of that is true. But I think a responsible council member who's not familiar with the policy and its impacts will want to have evidence and a discussion. Well, really, where's your research on this? We have it, but you know, some of the stuff takes a while to absorb. So meeting early with folks to dispel any of the myths about renter protections, to dispel from the Renters Alliance standpoint. I know there are some organizations out there that are a whole lot more radical than we are, but we certainly support a landlord's right to make a profit, to maintain his or her building, and to manage the property, and to do all of those things. We're not anti any of those things. We're not anti building new apartment buildings. If you want to do that, that's fine. What we're against is the idea that the only obligation of a landlord is to make as much profit as they can without any responsibility for the stability and quality of people's homes. And so housing does have a public policy importance. And that's something that we think might be good conversations to have with your colleagues on the Rockville Council. So we'd love to work with you on that. We also know lots of tenants in Rockville that I'm sure you're hearing from who would like to speak up.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say, Councilmember Dr. Miles has been very supportive of rent stabilization. And, you know, I'm sure my other colleagues are interested in having conversations and learning more, just to inform them on how this policy could look, and to also ensure that all of our residents have the stability, the affordability, and the predictability that they all need.
The other thing that we can also help do, which we did, we do all the time, we did it in Montgomery County in general, is we're happy to help organize community forums so that not only would we meet individually with the council members, but happy to meet in the buildings, in public squares, and invite your council members to hear directly from larger audiences of tenants and landlords alike. I mean, bring it on to the public forum and let's talk about it. Rumors, false information, misinformation is the enemy. You know, making sure people are educated and active is the way to go. So all of the mechanisms for that is what the Renters Alliance does. And we're here to help you.
All right, thank you so much for having me.
Terrific. Any questions for the council member?
We had a question in the chat if the tenants who testify, if it's required that they live in the incorporated city of Rockville.
It's not required, but I do think it does make an impact if you are living in the city of Rockville.
Right, of course. Thank
Clearly,
you.
I think it probably would be better, even though I'm not dissuading anybody from testifying, but those who are outside should probably be with tenant organizations or groups that represent tenants, and that the tenants themselves should probably be most often from Rockville, because there's nothing like an elected official seeing the people who will vote or not vote for them. So anyway, you've got our vote, Isola, in support of renter protections and rent stabilization. Also, and you're welcome to stay. I know that you're juggling multiple events like any good elected official is, but we're also going to talk a little bit about Gaithersburg if David is not being kidnapped by his children.
No, yeah, let's really appreciate that Rockville info, because it's definitely not the case in Gaithersburg, where we have this coming up on the city council's agenda anytime soon. And they just like happened in Rockville, the Gaithersburg Council wrote a letter to the county council against rent stabilization when the county was considering that. And so we have all but one of the current council sign, well, we have two new members sign that, but we don't have anybody on the Gaithersburg Council who's outspoken in favor of rent stabilization by any means. We have slightly different procedural stuff where our Commission on Landlord Tenant Affairs is charged with making policy recommendations to the council and the mayor specifically about rent stabilization and other issues. So we had our board member Josh Fisher and I are both on that commission and tenant representatives. And we had a public meeting where a lot of renter protections came up, as Matt mentioned. We're behind on some of basic things about notification of tenants, the radon things that were passed. And we had consensus across the landlords and tenants on the commission on virtually everything, except a 10% hard cap on rent increases was proposed by staff. And that just lit the room on fire, essentially. And there was definite division there. And the public members were wanting, that were there, not landlords nor tenants, were wanting some more discussion on that. But I would have to say that if you've been watching the meetings and things, it doesn't look like the council is too amenable to that discussion without being pushed like we're talking about here. So serious advocacy is definitely needed in Gaithersburg as well to try to get the council to take this up. Those other tenant protections will come on the agenda soon for the council since the commission recommended them. That may be a good time to try to mobilize some folks. We'll certainly update, people if that date comes out.
We attended, when was that meeting? A while back, when the Gaithersburg mayor, Judd Ashman, and the council supported a letter that went to the Montgomery County Council opposing the rent stabilization bill, and they took directly from the talking points of the landlord industry. And we packed that room full of tenants who gave excellent testimony and really caught the council and the mayor off guard with how much passionate testimony there was, competent and reasonable testimony, not just people upset about paying a lot of money, but people going like, you're risking our homes by not taking our need for affordable housing seriously. And I think it was a wake-up call in some ways for the Gaithersburg Council and for the mayor, not because it's going to happen overnight, but again, I've been at this now at least 15 years, and I know that Gaithersburg was nowhere on radar in terms of advancing renter protections, or Rockville for that matter, in terms of advancing renter protections, because Montgomery County was not really interested. And it wasn't until 2015 when we passed the first renter protection legislation that the Renters Alliance championed with County Executive Mark Elrich, who was on the council at the time. And it was a very modest piece of legislation, but it was revolutionary in that it demonstrated a growing recognition that tenants are becoming more and more active, are increasing in number, and living and demanding that their homes be stable. And also an increasing recognition that the lack of stability, if we do not make these protections, what are the costs there? So yeah, you could say, well, I don't care, that family got moved out, too bad for them. Well, it goes beyond that. We see social costs and financial costs to our communities. When children have to move from school to school, it impacts their academic achievement. That costs us. If kids don't perform well in school, it leads to all kinds of expensive problems, including crime. When we see seniors who are constantly anxious about being able to keep their homes, we see increased healthcare costs. When we see families who are not sure whether they're going to be able to stay in a home, put down roots, be part of the community, have their children in schools for the long term, they don't invest in the prosperity of the community that they would otherwise. So when you know you're stable, the curtains you buy are going to be different from what you're going to buy when you keep your bags packed. So there are lots of other costs that are often not considered that are being considered now because of our efforts and the efforts of our allies and other responsible elected officials and community leaders, that housing stability is good public policy. So that's the direction we're heading into. And again, very proud of our treasurer. I'm not just saying that because he's our board treasurer, but proud that he's on the Commission of Landlord Tenant Affairs for Rockville. And of course, David Mullins, our outreach director, who's a champion for renters' rights up in Gaithersburg, as well as working for us countywide. I saw a question about do landlords, what was it? Do they use algorithms? Yes, they do. The major corporate landlords view the value and marketability of their apartments when they offer an apartment, almost like looking at a stock market ticker tape. It comes out and it says what your apartment is worth at 3 o'clock on the afternoon on April 24th. And then they quote that value when they do a renewal notice. We think this is we understand why they're doing it. We understand the market research part of it. But again, without the balance of responsibility of what's fair in terms of increasing rents according to increased legitimately related overhead to running the property, is unconscionable to us.
Well, if I may, Matt, too, because
Yeah.
some of the arguments are always pointing to this fair market that's going to be disrupted, by something like rent stabilization or things, and that is like that. Harper's reported that there are lawsuits slogging their ways, of course, through the courts, pointing out that this is price fixing, actually, and alleged on a national scale. So it takes forever to get through, but the reporting says that these are being challenged as like cartelish behavior. So hopefully we'll see some results.
Well, I mean, it brings into question all regulations. That everybody assumes that anything that is related to a market is in a laissez-faire free market without any rules. If we did that to water, okay, say you own the property where the reservoir is. Now you're going to charge, because everybody needs it, so we're going to charge $1,000 a gallon, right? Because people are going to pay it. Not everybody can, but some are going to pay it because they're going to get thirsty. So the question is, how related to laissez-faire market rules should housing be? It has been traditional that there's been enough housing to let the market do what it's going to do, because people had choices. If your property manager wasn't doing well, you could punish them by moving. You could punish them in any number of ways. So the market sort of policed itself. But when you have a high demand market, which we're seeing now, we have a national housing crisis where there's not enough housing and demand for housing is high, it allows for a market to gouge, to say we've got something that's scarce and people need it. They don't just want it. It's not fancy high heels or pocketbooks or sneakers or a diamond ring. This is something that everybody needs. Housing is something that everybody needs. And so in that environment, we think it has to balance as a market with thinking like a utility. So there's a role for charging so that people can make a profit and maintain properties. There's a role for the market, but there's also a role for balancing it with the public interest. And so when we talk about price fixing, there's a balance of how much profit you can make versus what the public interest is in keeping stable, affordable housing and quality housing. It's nothing new. We have food that is regulated. We have utilities that are regulated in terms of price. We have oil and gas that are regulated in terms of price. So why shouldn't housing also be under that consideration? It's not whether or not there should be a framework of reasonable regulations. The question is how much? So that should be where the argument is, not whether or not, oh my God, there's price fixing going on. That's like the excuse me for bringing in this argument, but folks who, oppose gun control say, oh my God, as soon as you do that, we're going to take away our Second Amendment rights. Well, no, there has always been regulations about weapons in the United States. Can't have a nuclear bomb, not allowed. Not allowed to have a tank in your front lawn. So we do say certain things are not allowed. So the regulation is there. The question is what's fair and how much.
And what cuts through all those theoretical weeds is always, the stories. So again, that's where the advocacy that we're encouraging, people showing up and telling their actual impact story is going to cut right through all that too for council members.
Right.
Matt, sorry, I want to revisit an issue that came up a few minutes ago, where so I am a 24-year county employee, shop steward for McGeo, and active member and community organizer. And when I am out in my community, trying to organize tenants together to testify at mayor and city council meetings, and this is after both Rockville and the municipalities of Rockville and Gaithersburg both wrote a letter in opposition to rent stabilization in their communities. I tried to organize tenants to come out and testify during public comments, as did our outreach director. the comments that we receive from tenants is that it doesn't matter.
What
It doesn't matter because it's been written before. It's already, you know, in the legislators' minds, council members and mayors alike, that it's that they don't want it. Can you speak to how important it is to advocate during public comments and how effective it is, please?
Well, again, you and I, me more than you, Josh, but we have some years under our belt. And as I say, I've been doing this for a little more than 15 years, plus my career before I got involved with all this, working in politics and with labor and in government and other nonprofits. You know, unfortunately, there is a long view. As the parallel analysis would be the civil rights movement. That did not happen overnight. It did not happen because of one, sitting at a counter. It did not happen because of one terrible event. It happened because of decades of activism by thousands and thousands of people who weighed in on this issue and educated the public and put pressure on their elected officials to change their minds and get them to a place where it became possible. When we passed the first renter protection legislation in 2015, I won't name the name, but one of the council members who was a leader at the time, she laughed in my face and said, "This will never pass. That renters, do not have an organized voice in the county, and we're just not going to take you seriously." And we, began a campaign with the help of then County Executive Mike Leggett, certainly with County Council member at the time, Mark Elrich, and others in the community to say, hey, wait a second, FYI, back in 2015, renters were approaching 33% of the county. Wake up, elected officials. If you're any kind of professional politician, you better pay attention to demographics. Then we also activated some of the key constituents, not just folks who didn't want to pay rent at all, or somebody who just, was to hell with everything, but, responsible citizens throughout the county, a diverse group of citizens, racially diverse, economically diverse, religiously diverse, age-wise diverse, from a cross-section, saying that all different types of people need and want affordable, stable, quality housing. And we moved the legislation from, in that time there was 9 council members, we moved it to support of 5 council members, which was unprecedented. And then tragically, the Flower Branch explosion took place. And there was national attention on quality of housing in Montgomery County, the vulnerability of tenants when they're making complaints and not being listened to, and so on. And then I don't think any council member was able to avoid supporting this very modest piece of legislation. But all of that was built on years of talking and being active and advocating. So what I don't want to say is that if you show up July 8th, we're going to kill this dragon. No, we need to do it before, now, and after, all the way through, and in all kinds of ways. And through the magic of these public campaigns, and of course the belief, as I do, that we're right, can't be wrong. We could do this for 20 years. And if we're wrong, people are going to increasingly understand that we're wrong. But we're right. This is fair, reasonable public policy. And so through individual meetings, community meetings, discussions like this one, discussions with the press that cover the issue increasingly from time to time, this will create a public consciousness and an awareness by our policymakers that it's time to move. Those that say my vote doesn't count or my one voice doesn't count, maybe in isolation you can make that argument, but one has to think about all of these activities collectively together and how it creates overall power. So thanks for the puffball question. Right. And, for those of you who want it to happen tomorrow, don't forget we've been at this for a long time. So maybe tomorrow is when it's going to happen. So, stay confident, or at least hopeful. What else, folks? If there is no question or concern, I want to remind everybody who's listening, if you have a question not related to the discussion tonight, but an individual question about your apartment community or an issue you've got in your apartment community, please raise it in the chat and we'll address it. David?
I did want to mention, I think I saw earlier a couple of, when we were having discussion, just some of the high increases people are seeing. We've been clarifying in the chat that there is no law right now, right? That they still can increase it. However, these excessive increases, we still recommend you report them to the Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs. And I mean, it's especially excessive ones could be considered an eviction, and you might want to speak with legal aid or even someone. But please let us know, and report if it's excessive. We still need to report those, even though there's not an actual cap yet.
That's right. Emily did put that link to a complaint form in the chat. Please do, if you think that your rent increase is excessive, and I would say anything above 6% is, then file that complaint. By the way, I think anything above 3% is, but I think the landlord tenant will pay attention if it's over 6%, and submit the complaint so that at least they can track these things. I also recommend, I didn't say before, but there's no reason why any tenant can't go back down and try to negotiate a lower rent. We have seen some renters who are able to do that. We can also consult with you individually on the best tactics for negotiating with property managers and landlords. In some cases, we've seen some real dramatic reductions in increases. Some increases are just done because they put it down on paper and they don't even think about it. And then when you call attention to them, they reduce it. So that's also a possibility. I want to also remind folks quickly about available resources that exist as we keep people informed about what your avenues of enforcement and support are. So Tim, would you talk about code, please?
Yeah, so code would apply to anything that is like structurally wrong in your unit, like if there is mold or if like your lights aren't working, things like that. You can contact code enforcement, which I'll link below, and make a complaint. But first, we'd recommend reporting these issues to your management and then going to code if they have not addressed it within a reasonable time.
Right, and just underscoring, that's for maintenance issues, vermin, broken appliances. That's what code is for. Those are housing codes. Your landlord has to maintain things in good working order. Air conditioning has to be in good working order. Heat has to be in good working order. Your refrigerator has to be in good working order, and so on. So that's if you've given your property manager or landlord due notice, and in a reasonable period of time they've ignored you, then you should file a complaint with code. Emily, would you talk about the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs?
Yeah, so that's going to be the other resource for renters who need to make a complaint. Like David mentioned, and I put the link in there already. If you receive an excessive rent increase, that's the department you're going to want to file a complaint with. But it could also range from like retaliation, harassment, lease rental ledger issues, anything that's not code enforcement, like maintenance issues. And it has to do with your lease or the relationship with the landlord, that's going to go to Office of Landlord Tenant. And if, again, just like code, we recommend you talk to the property manager first to see if you can resolve the issue with them, and then use the complaint as an escalation.
We even more than recommend it. It is required in the complaint process. You don't want to file a complaint with landlord, tenant, or code and have them say, well, what did the landlord say? And say, well, I didn't tell him. Well, that's not fair. So you have to go to the property manager or the landlord first and do that. And landlord, tenant, as Emily says, leases, quality of life in the building, and your rights, like forming.
And document it. All communication with the property owner should be documented.
Right. And forming tenants associations. Malek, do you want to say something about that?
I would love to say something about that. The power of the group is enormous. So what we like to do is we go into communities, go into apartment buildings, and we help them create tenant associations. Tenant association basically is just, for instance, we're dealing with another community where there's a pest situation. It's just one person, but actually it's a group of people. So when we go collectively to property management, there's power in those numbers. Not only that, it's about creating a community, building a community rather than separating it. So you should always reach out to us. We can help you do that. It's a really easy, simple process. First, it's just getting everybody together. Then we find a couple of point leaders, and then we go from there.
Great. Thank you, Malek. David, I don't know where you've gone, but I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk about the Access to Council program if you're anywhere near your computer. There he is.
I didn't hear my name, but I heard Access to Council. So
There you go. That's you.
Tell me to, yeah, that's a state-funded program that the funding goes to in Montgomery County. It's Legal Aid, CASA, and the Homeless Persons Representation Project are three free legal service providers that are there for tenants facing eviction in housing court. And
if they're eligible.
Right. And so if you are facing eviction, meaning you're there for a failure to pay rent case or a tenant holding over, they're there at court for same day representation. In certain cases, you have to find them but they're floating around. But then we recommend you try to reach out earlier, and if you're income eligible, then they can hopefully take your case and represent you or work something out. But that is that's goes by ACE for Access to Counsel in Evictions. And again, we're glad to connect you. The earlier the better. So we're glad we're glad to connect you again. That's Legal Aid and CASA and HPRP. But also look for them down at the court. If you're at the court for housing related issues and you have questions, there's also an attorney you can walk in and talk to on the second floor in the Montgomery County the district court there.
Jean, I'm not sure what your question is. If I could get some more clarification on how long do landlords have to return? I'm not sure what that means. Give me some more information and we can address it. In the meantime, let me tell people we'll have our next town hall May 8th. Hopefully by then, we'll have more information on the rent regulations. We are a partner with the Maryland Legal Services Corporation on the Access to Counsel in evictions. If you think that you're going to need a lawyer, and you're not sure how to go about it, then you can certainly reach out to us at info@rentersalliance.org. We can give you some advice, not legal advice, but we can give you our best judgment on how to approach your case. And if necessary, we can link you up directly to the legal resources, the lawyers, if need be, as David has outlined. Do we have anything more from Jean? I'd hate to not get your question if I can.
To return the deposit.
Gotcha. The deposit law. I'm not a lawyer, but I do know this law. You have to, a landlord, first of all, has to keep your security deposit in an interest-bearing account separate from his or her own finances. They often don't, but they're supposed to by law. Second, when you move out, you should have a walkthrough with the landlord. Take photographs of your apartment. You should do that when you move in, and you should do it when you move out. Take photographs of everything. You are responsible for damages. However, the landlord cannot take anything out of your security deposit until they provide you by first-class mail a letter that details what the damages are and the actual costs of repairing those damages. Not what they think it's going to cost, not what their brother-in-law says it's going to cost to replace the painting on the ceiling, but what it actually cost to repair it. So it has to have been done, and they have to have paid the bill and can show the bill. Then they can detail those expenses in that first-class letter to you that has to be provided to you at your next known address within 45 days. If after 45 days they have not provided you that information, or they provided you with a defective notice, that is, we think it's going to cost $25,000 to repair the apartment. We haven't done it yet, but we think that's what it's going to cost. That's not what's required. If they fail to do what is required according to the law, and if somebody could put that law in the chat, that would be great. They forfeit any right to any part of the security deposit. Now, that is a very common fight. And if there is a violation of that law, we believe it is one that should be won by the tenant. But it is not as easy as all that. We have seen the Commission on Landlord and Tenant Affairs, despite ample evidence that a violation has occurred, split the baby and give the landlord some money. But we are very eager to support tenants in those cases to make sure that you get your rights enforced. So there is a calculator in the Department of Housing and Community Development at the state level on what your interest should be. And unfortunately, this gets a little complicated, but if you've lived in an apartment building for 20 or 30 years and put a security deposit down 30 years ago, your interest rate is going to be different from somebody who put in their deposit in the last 5 years. So I think the interest rate 20, 30 years ago was about 3%. Now it's like 1%. So, but there are ways of calculating that so that you get all of what you're entitled to back. But remember, 45 days. Don't leave the apartment without taking pictures. You demand that the landlord or property manager do a walkthrough with you. Have a sheet. If they don't have one, you can find these on websites of walkthrough forms that check off everything working, everything was in proper condition, that allow the property manager to sign off on the walkthrough form saying everything's fine, or they're saying that the refrigerator is broken and you broke it. Well, at least now you'll know. But if they don't do that and they say everything's fine, and then you get a week later that, you know, you owe for the refrigerator that you didn't break, you know, then you have a case. Anyway, that's the process, 45 days. Thank you, Karen. It's on the Montgomery County Landlord in the handbook, so use it. I would expect them to return it to you in a reasonable period of time. I don't believe that there's a statute. David, help me. Is there a requirement to how fast they have to give you the check after the 45 days?
I don't know. I'll be going to that website that Emily just posted.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I think it goes into the what's reasonable and proper category. So, you know, the clock starts ticking after 45 days. Put on your Judge Judy hat. When does it become unreasonable that they didn't return your security deposit after the 45 days? If they've got the money, how complicated is it to write the check and send it to you? If you think that they're holding back the check and they do violate your rights and the law, they could be subject to paying 3 times the amount of your security deposit as a penalty. So at some point, they cross a red line, but I'm not sure where that red line is. Anything else? As we approach the 8:30 hour, I thought we were going to be a shorter town hall. Naturally, in talking landlord-tenant, there's always lots to talk about. So with that, again, our next Renter Town Hall is May 8th. Please contact us at info@rentersalliance.org. Thank you to Council Member from Rockville, Isola Shaw, for her words of wisdom and support for renters' rights in Rockville. Thank you to our Treasurer and Board Member, Josh Fisher, and to all of our staff. Thank you and good night.